The Secret Science at Work by Max Freedom Long. Chapter 17. Are fixations brought over from former lives? Are there unsuspected spirit obsessions? In all forms of psychoanalysis, as had been said, the operators depend not only on dreams, but also upon the thoughts which occur as the patient in a relaxed physical condition allows his mind to wander at will, one idea calling up another by free association. The things that come up into the minds of patients under these conditions are like waking dreams and are studied in the same way as dreams while asleep, to discover in them symbols or other clues which may help to identify the memories of events which have caused complexes. The patient often imagines scenes, people, places, and experiences which are almost as real to him as his dreams, and he describes these to his analyst as he would his dreams. Because of the vividness of these impressions, and because they often seem to be so true to life, there arose a very interesting perplexity. Were these waking dreams to be considered figments of imagination, or were some of the memories being recalled of events and circumstances related to the past lives of the patient? Freud inclined to the opinion that both night and daydreams of the kind mentioned were based on imagination and were not experiences. As such, he set about analyzing them both as psychological structures in which might be hidden symbols which would point to the origin of the complex or fixation. Later, when Jung broke away from the Freudian principles, he seemed to think this theory hardly good enough to explain the matter. Jung suggested that each of us may inherit through the genes a portion of the racial memory, in quotes, racial memory, and because of this, may seem to remember events in our own past lives, which actually took place in the lives of ancestors of the race. These memories were supposed to be common to all of the race, and not actual and individual experiences of any one patient. This theory seems to have interested him enormously, for he is spending his declining years in research through legends and medieval writings to try to find the meaning of symbols and archetypes in the history of the race. Other analysts have been speaking and writing of the evidence they have found that events lived through past incarnations of the individual were being remembered. The investigators of the psychical research societies have already broken ground in this direction, and many of them have become convinced that reincarnation is a fact, and that memories from past lives are sometimes recalled. Mr. Hubbard, in his latest research called Scientology Takes This Stand. Let us take up briefly one of the most recent and convincing reports on tests aimed at exploring the combined questions of past incarnations and fixations carried over from them. These tests were made around the year 1945 by a famous medium and investigator, Geraldine Cummins, Cummins, working and writing with Dr. R. Connell in England. See their book, Perceptive Healing. Miss Cummins found, by the use of psychic senses, that many strange illnesses and mental quirks in various members of certain old families in England seemed to arise from memories brought over from past lives. This family was Jewish, and the terrors of persecution made up most of the memories lasting through from other lives, especially the life immediately previous. I quote from her book, quote, "This narrative, one telling of the special instance in the life of a patient, it is submitted, justifies the assumption that in accessing the actions of others, the memories handed down to them from the past should be investigated and appraised before any final judgment can be passed on them. The fears, the persecutions, the nights of horror, the torture chambers, the silent graves of friends and relatives unjustly slain. Any such experiences from the life adventures of ancestors could undoubtedly extend their influence out of the past and affect the actions of descendants in the present, particularly if such descendants suffered from some minor mental shock or trauma of an analogous nature. Thus, an act of cowardice, as it is popularly conceived, may well have been initiated by some terrible and insistent urge out of the forgotten past, which, unknown and unexplained, has condemned many a man to the opprobrium, opprobrium of his fellows. The psychological as well as the physical attributes are inherited, modified, or aggravated as each generation passes, according to the genes that carry them are dominant or recessive. Terrors quite incomprehensible to some of us have their roots nourished by forgotten horrors. Dead hands stretch out of the past and mold the present. Into the future they extend their clutching fingers and twist and distort our decisions and destinies. And we, blind anthropoids, too often think the decisions are ours and ours alone, that the successful achievements of our lives are entirely of our own fashioning, that the crimes and the failures of others are matters for unqualified condemnation. End quote. The transmission of the end results of reactions caused by terrible experiences from parent to child is commented on by the writers in the discussion of another case. Quote, one cannot contemplate the present agony of the human race without endeavoring to assess some of its consequences in connection with the generations that are yet to come. End quote. Dr. Connell tells of assisting a male child into the world after the First World War. The father of the child had experienced 9 months of work in a German coal mine. He was a prisoner of war. During that period, he was in a coal mine. He never saw daylight, suffered unspeakably, physically and emotionally. Fear haunted him. Until his son reached the age of 10 years, he had such a horror of all visitors that he always hid under a bed or a table when strangers came and whenever the doctor was called. His illnesses were nightmares to both. He was born with a terrible fear complex, dominant, and even now, 20 years later, in spite of the most careful upbringing, he has a haunted look. A daughter, born 4 years later, took after her mother and had no such heritage. In some schools of psychoanalysis, it is thought that from the moment of conception there is some way in which the embryo senses and remembers words spoken by the parents, especially if there is much emotion or some pain felt at the time of this recording. The facts seem to bear it out, and Huna can give an explanation. Only the low self, in its aka or shadowy body, is connected with the embryo, as the middle self does not begin to play its part in the infant until some time after birth. All words and other impressions are remembered by the low self, and it alone, with the result that such memories are not subjected to the correcting light of the middle self reason. They thus remain in the form of blind and hidden memories, which later cause strange fears and other mental reactions. In nearly all cases, the urges to action caused by these fixations tend to cause physical ills if the urges are frustrated and beaten down. In the case of the boy mentioned above, it could be explained that while he inherited through his genes the mental characteristics which might respond to similar fears, the real cause of his terrors might well have been the pictures drawn with such emotion by the father in the presence of the pregnant mother in recounting his experiences and terrors. The low self, being illogical, would react to the words literally as compulsions, not related to actual events or to their place in time. One possibility which appeals to us in our study of kahuna methods seems to have been overlooked by most students of these matters. The idea is that the spirits of the dead attach themselves to the living and force upon them memories of their own lives in the flesh. Psychologists have studied such manifestations and have classified the attached spirits as split-off parts of the resident spirit or personality. Under the influence of hypnotic suggestion, the secondary personalities, or spirits as the case may be, have been brought to the surface and conversed with. Many of them have their own memories of life in the flesh, and almost always they try to influence the person whom they victimize, forcing thoughts and emotions and impulses on them, or at night taking the body on sleepwalking expeditions. They often remember their death pangs in earthly life, and their sicknesses, pains, and sorrows, and cause symptoms or emotions corresponding to them to appear in the one whom they have tied themselves to, and on whose vital forces they feed to give themselves strength of will to exert a form of hypnotic command in many cases. It seems natural that the spirits of ancestors should select members of the following generations as their victims and hosts. This being the case, we might account for memories and compulsive reactions which are forced upon the living, and which, because the source seems to be their own inner life, causes the belief of experiences from a past life to be carried over from their own past life or lives, not the earthly life of some attached spirit ancestor. Modern psychiatrists are fully aware of all of the outward appearances of spirit influences, beginning with the very slight and intermittent influences and ending with complete obsession. However, it is taboo to be so unscientific as to admit that there might be such a thing as a spirit, or as survival after death, or as a set of memories brought over from past life. The symptoms, which have been known for many centuries and which have been laid to spirit obsession, have been neatly cataloged and given new names. Under the heading of obsession, in the Freud Dictionary of Psychoanalysis, already quoted, this point is well illustrated. Obsession, obsessions are always reproaches, re-emerging in a transmuted form under repression, reproaches which are invariably related to a sexual deed performed with pleasure in childhood. Two components are found in every obsession. 1. An idea that forces itself upon the patient. 2. An associated emotional state. It will be seen that Freud made careful note of the compulsive strength of a thought. He, of course, related it to a repressed sexual thought, but certainly in obsession it could have been forced on the patient by a spirit. He also noted the change in the emotional state of the patient to fit the compulsive thought. The question is left open as to whether the thought aroused the emotion or whether the emotion also came from the spirit and was not generated in the patient. Obsessive acts and ceremonials were assigned by Freud to the unconscious part of the mind because, despite reason and logic, the patient is unable to resist the urge to do certain things. In the mental hospitals of today, aside from patients whose brains have been injured by disease or such poisons as alcohol, Schizophrenia or split personality accounts for the majority of cases. Shocks, stresses, strains, fixations, almost anything that weakens the individual on a mental and will level, or by taking too much of his mana, may allow the secondary personalities to make their presence felt to a greater or lesser degree. Shock treatment by electricity, insulin, or other drugs is a popular remedy, and while hard on the patient, it is often effective. Then it says in brackets, the Kahunas used a mana shock treatment method long ago as mentioned before. Close bracket. Of all the medically trained psychiatrists, only one, as far as I know, actually recognized obsession for what it is. He broke away from the hindering scientific traditions of his profession to break ground in finding a better means of casting out these evil devils, or evil spirits, casting out these evil spirits or devils, which were so well known to the Kahunas of Polynesia, and which are also discussed in the Bible. This man was Dr. Carl Wickland, Wickland, an American who during his later years gave his time and attention to obsessional angles and was denied either recognition or a hearing. However, he did pioneer work of an advanced order, obtained excellent results in many cases, and left a remarkable record of his findings, theories, and methods in his books, the best known of which is his 30 Years Among the Dead. His method was to drive obsessing or attached spirits out of or away from the patient by a shock of static electricity. The spirit was directed to enter the body of Mrs. Wickland, who was a psychic, and there it was talked with, persuaded to leave the patient alone, and handed over to the good spirit guides to be cared for or forced to change its way. It was an entirely unscientific method, but many cures were made and much help given to sufferers. Since the kahunas of the healing orders were either trained psychics or used a psychic as an assistant, they were constantly on the lookout for spirits which had fastened themselves to the living and were causing some degree of illness or mental trouble. These spirits, because they invariably drew mana from the living to strengthen themselves, were called eating companions by the kahunas, and in all efforts to heal a patient, they were watched for and if found were removed, just as were the complexes. The observed technique for the removal of evil spirits was, as related before, the accumulation of a very large shock charge of mana, and the use of it, coupled with a type of mesmeric suggestion to dislodge the obsessing spirit. Also, the high self of the kahuna was furnished with sufficient mana for its aid in the operation when asked for help. Always there was available, too, the powerful cooperation of the po amakua. The complexes and the evil spirits eating one inside were lumped together in the same classification of sin as were deeds of hurt done others or mistakes in good conduct. And it is important to state again, all these elements which went to make up sin were basically bad because they caused the low self of the ill or troubled or obsessed person to refuse to make the contact with the high self. Since refusal resulted in a blocked path to the high self, and in order to obtain healing, it was necessary to open the path. The first essential was to correct the things that caused it to be blocked by the low self. We find in the New Testament many references to the work of casting out evil spirits as a healing practice. Little is known of the early training of Jesus, but from what he did and what he taught, it's evident that he was a member of the highest healing order of kahunas. As he healed and as he taught his disciples to heal as part of their ministry, His teachings are of the greatest value in the reconstruction of the ancient lore at this late date. He and his disciples stressed the part played in illness by evil spirits and drove them out of patients in order to bring about healing. Sometimes the evil spirits were called devils. In the Old Testament, the word devil appeared only 4 times in the King James Version. In the original Hebrew, the words used were seirim, S-A-I-R-I-M, and shedim, S-H-E-D-I-M, both used twice and meaning respectively, as given in the Revised Version, he-goats or satyrs and demons. The devil, in contrast, was a fallen angel, Satan, the prince of darkness, who believed to be just a little less powerful than God. He was given the title of the adversary and the tempter. In the New Testament, Jesus is said to have wrestled with Satan and to have been tempted by him in his guise of the Prince of Darkness. A little of this confusion can be cleared up by going back to an older religion of Huna, to the older religion of Huna. It is beautiful and very effective symbols. Now, in it, beautiful and very effective symbols were used to present basic ideas, which range from magnificent and vague concepts, such as those involved in the theory of creation, and the common basic concepts, such as those of the 3 selves of man, evil spirits, sin in general, and so on. The creation of the universe was, in Huna, symbolized as a titanic struggle between light and darkness. Both were symbolized and personified. Light was supreme intelligence and good. Darkness was a lack of intelligence, stupidity, inertia, and the breeding and residing place of evil, of all that was adverse to light and goodness. The personified darkness was overcome by the personified light, and creation was the result. However, the struggle was not ended. All through the long upward progression of created things, including man, the struggle between darkness and light continued as the conflict of great shadowing elemental powers, and as fragments of those powers lying in the hearts of men and continuing the struggle on a smaller scale. The darkness was symbolically broken up into small parts, which were able to enter and direct all men who were evil, also all spirits of evil men. These remaining evil and bound to earthly levels after physical death. On the other hand, light was presented as the high selves, one for each man, to be his light and to guide him out of the ways of darkness. One of the most rewarding efforts of this line of seeking is to understand the composite nature of sin. Came in the work of translating the baffling meanings behind the story of the Garden of Eden into the Polynesian language. Most people today understand that this is an allegory, not a statement of historical fact about a specific people and a geographical place. It is the story of every man who falls from his natural state of contact with his high self. The story has been found not only in biblical writings, but the world around, told in many languages and with many versions. It was common property of the civilizations which centered in the Near East centuries ago. Let me read that sentence again. It was common property of the civilizations which centered in the Near East centuries ago. That it originated with the Kahunas of old, there seems little doubt, for in any dialect of the Polynesian tongue, it gives up Huna secrets which are foreign to any other language, people, or philosophy. In the Garden of Eden, as the story was recorded in the Old Testament, there stood one tree which was set aside, and its fruit forbidden to Adam and Eve. The serpent tempted Eve to eat the fruit. She persuaded Adam to partake of it, and they were expelled from the garden. Now, fruit, in quotes, has hua, H-U-A, and its meaning is 1. To be much addicted to evil, 2. To quarrel, be angry, to envy. The serpent of Genesis, in quotes, like the Satan of Job, the Hillel of Isaiah, and the dragon of both Isaiah and the Apocalypse, close bracket, is understood as symbolizing the first cause of sin, death, and evil, and so the revolt against God, the light, and the good. They are all sin symbols in Huna, and the word mu, M-O-O, covers them all. The word meaning any kind of reptile, which has the secondary Huna meaning of to dry, which is the symbol of taking and wasting the water of life, or mana. The serpent then was the spirit of the eating companion class. We know this because it stole and squandered mana from the low self, dried him out according to the Huna symbology. This serpent tempted Eve. The word for tempt, wala wala, W-A-L-E, means not only to tempt, but also to entrap and to snare. This is important in understanding the Huna meaning of the story, because the snare, the trap, or any form of net, whenever mentioned in describing any part of Huna, is the symbol of either an eating companion or obsessing spirit of a complex. As modern botanists assure us, the apple was not yet developed in biblical times. It was first used by painters of imaginative pictures depicting the Garden of Eden in Europe much later. It was not stated in Genesis that the tree bore apples. It was simply the fruit of the tree of knowledge. In the Polynesian version, however, every evidence is given that the story originated in some tropical land. The tree was described as a breadfruit tree, and near it grew an ohia tree, both tropicals. Ohia is spelled O-H-I-A. Ulu, U-L-U, is the word for breadfruit, but it has a surprising number of Huna meanings, which tell directly, or by the use of symbols, the nature of the eating companions, what they do to their hosts, and what they force their hosts to do. These meanings show us what was considered the gravest sin of mankind. 1. To be influenced to a greater or lesser degree by spirits of the dead. At worst, to be completely obsessed by them. 2. To grow as in size and strength. This points to the increase in strength of the spirits when they draw mana from their victims, dry them out. 3. To grow as more angry or more evil. The spirits, once they are tolerated by the victim and allowed to feed on his mana, grow more and more powerful and more able to force their evil impulses on the victim. They become more and more able to obsess him and gain more complete control of his body. The ohia tree, which in the Polynesian or Huna version of the story stood beside the breadfruit tree, gives us more meanings which corroborate those hidden in Ulu. 1. To force, to compel, to restrain. These describe very well the methods and abilities of eating companions, spirits in relation to the influence of their hosts. 2. To be deceitful, evil, sinful, wicked. This tells us the nature of the spirits. The sin of Adam and Eve was that of harboring evil thoughts, so similar to those evil spirits that they were in agreement or of like minds. The spirits were for this reason allowed by the low self of the man and woman to attach themselves to them. Very soon they began accepting their evil ideas and impulses as their own. Thus, they were driven from the allegorical position of sinless goodness, or in other words, from the condition of natural and full contact with their own high selves. In the Genesis story, the serpent was cast out, and a curse was placed upon him. Adam's punishment, that he was forced to live by the sweat of his brow and farm the land which God cursed, so that it grew thistles and briars. Thistles, thorns, and briars, it will be remembered, are, in Huna, symbols of either eating companions or complexes. The Kahunas seem to have used the same set of symbols for both, no doubt because the two produce the same symptoms in their patients. The garden is the ideal and normal condition of life when one is free from any blockings of the path, which come under the headings of sins in Huna. The word for garden is kihapia. Kihapai. Kihapaya. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. That's the word for garden. Okay. Its secret meanings are to be found in the root words of which it is composed. Its secret meanings are to be found in the root words of which it is composed. That is the word for garden. Okay. So the first root is ki, which means to squirt water, symbol of sending the accumulated surcharge of mana to the high self along the connecting aka cord. This can only be done when the individual is in the ideal or normal condition, in which his path is not blocked by one of the forms of sin. The second root is pai, P-A-I, to be tied in bundles, to be in clusters, symbol of the clusters of thought forms or visualized picture of the thing being desired. These clusters are sent with the mana flow over the aka cord to the high self in the Huna type of prayer. Number 3. This root is ha, H-A, to breathe heavily, symbol of accumulating surcharge of mana. Such accumulation usually is accompanied by heavier breathing. Number 4. Roots combined and ha-pai, H-A-P-A-I, to lift up. This is the symbol of sending or lifting up the thought form clusters to the high self. The Genesis account tells us that after Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden because of their sins, because they had allowed the serpent to tempt them successfully, God placed cherubims with flaming swords to the east of the garden to guard or keep the way of the tree of life. The word for sword is pahi, P-A-H-I, the roots of which, pa and he, give the meaning of drying out and purging away something. The secret is that the ideal condition symbolized by the garden is protected by the high self against the intrusion of evil spirits. They are kept from being strong enough to control the living by themselves, being dried out or prevented from obtaining mana. The purging is also to flow away and furnishes a check on the first meaning, in that mana symbolizes a fluid and is made to leave the spirits if they have some of it in their possession, as they would have if found obsessing a living person. The work of driving them away and rendering them weak and harmless was carried out by the high self. The way of the tree of life, which was to be guarded, symbolizes the aka cord. It is the thing that is to be kept unblocked and open. The evil spirits are to be kept from causing such a blocking. From the Kahunas, we learn the great truth that if we go to the end of life and die without being cleansed of our fixations, we take them with us. On the other side, they hang like millstones around the neck and prevent clear understanding, which would normally allow one to go on and progress as one should in the evolutionary stages towards perfection. The fixations and unreformed evil of one's nature hold one to the earth level and tend to make one to become an eating companion. There are many rites in the Catholic Church which can be traced back to Huna origins or to a source in Huna ideas and beliefs, even if the meaning of the rite has been partly lost. One of these is the rite of extreme unction, and the Catholics make every effort to perform it with the intention of giving a last and final cleansing to those who are about to die. The rite of the confessional, with that of absolution, should, if properly understood and administered, clear away and keep cleared away the fixations from the path of the individual during life, and he should go on freed and sane and unhampered at death. The Church has also the rite of exorcism for the removal of the eating companions, and in every case the rites are performed with the use of holy water, even though it is now understood that this symbolizes the calling down of the high mana for cleansing purposes and presupposes the aid of the high self, who beforehand must have been provided with a sufficient supply of low mana to work with. In Tibet, there has existed for centuries a written ritual which is often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to compare it with the better-known one of the ancient Egypt. Both of these writings were aimed at assisting a dying person to progress properly from life into the state after death. In Tibet, it has been the custom to have these ritual instructions read to the dying by a priest, the recital continuing for some time after the death, under the conviction that the dead can hear and follow the directions given for their entry into Bardo, the hereafter. In both rites, stress is laid on the great value inherent in a life properly lived on earth. The state after death is seen as a continuation of life and of the same inclinations. If these inclinations are not good, trouble can come swiftly on the other side, it is believed, for evil spirits lurk there who are inimical to all those caught on lower planes of the hereafter. If there is any truth in all of religion, one must conclude that the condition after death depends much on the moral progress during life. The belief in obsession or eating companions is no longer fantastic thanks to a century of work in physical research and the many proofs found for human survival. The complex or fixation has been rediscovered in modern psychology. The alarming incidence of insanity in our time, coupled with ill-informed treatment of the victims in most institutions, would seem to compel an examination into the probability of obsessing spirits in at least some of the cases. Psychiatry has proved that it is possible to restore some people to sanity by removing the complexes. Why not go on to study those patients very obviously obsessed by a spirit outside themselves? And that concludes chapter 17. Chapter 18 is called The Various Degrees of Fixation and Obsessional Influence with a Self-Test Chart.